History is made by nations. They move from the medieval darkness to the light and greatness. They are led by outstanding people, chosen by God from their kind for their audacity and readiness to risk all they have, including their lives, for an idea. A passionate persecutor of the Christians, Pavel was in fact destined to become one of the main authors of Christian theology and to preach the apostolic church around the world. Constantine the Great, who had spilled so much blood fighting for power, became the first Christian emperor in Roman history and laid the foundations of the new European civilization. A young ruler of northern barbarians, descendant of bloodthirsty Vikings, was to turn separate Slavic tribes into a nation, isolated territories into a unique state, to lay the foundation of a great empire, which is still the biggest geopolitical unit on earth. At birth, he was called Vladimir, at baptism, Vasily. National tradition calls him the Son, and in history, he is known as the equal of the apostles, Prince Vladimir the Saint. Prince Vladimir was born here, in the region of Pskov, in a village that is now called Budnik. In the 10th century, it was called Budutina Ves. The exact date of his birth is unknown. Vladimir was born between 960 and 962 from an illegal union of a prince and a slave. It was not by birthright, but out of love that Princess Olga's housekeeper found herself in bed with Olga's son, Sviatoslav Igorovich. The severe ruler of Kiev couldn't tolerate the breach of propriety in her own house. Malusha, the mother of the future prince, was sent away to the Pskov lands of her lady. There the boy was born and was given the name Vladimir, which means great in his power. The name chosen by Sviatoslav for his son gave him the power of his ancestors, and his title defined his destiny and installed him in a position far above the common people. But the boy didn't see his father until he was 3. 1,000 years ago, Cheryocha was a big river. The young prince was playing near the water when the quick stream carried him away. A second more, and the future Christianizer of Russia would have sunk, but some miracle helped him to grasp a big stone. Legend has it that the villagers of Budutina Ves, now Budnik, took a miraculous stone out of the water, and it became an object of pilgrimage. Today, as hundreds of years ago, people come to this stone to touch the relic and feel the connection with history. What values did Vladimir learn as a child? What rules were followed by his ancestors and the people that surrounded him? In other words, what blood did he have? His great-grandfather Rurik was the first Russian prince, a descendant of Scandinavian warriors, those severe pirates of the Baltic Sea, the Vikings. The Vikings were brave seamen and fearless soldiers. Scandinavia was then inhabited by several tribes, the ancestors of modern Danes, Norwegians and Swedes. They lived in small communities spread out over the shores of Scandinavian fjords in squat wooden houses. The growth of the population and the poor natural resources forced men to leave their homes almost every year to conquer and devastate near and remote lands. The word Viking originally meant the participants in such campaigns and referred to the profession rather than ethnicity. For centuries, the Vikings lived exclusively on looting. When a boy was born in a family, the father put a sword into the cradle on one side and an axe on the other and pronounced, "With this, you'll achieve glory and wealth." But a chest loaded with treasure wasn't their ultimate goal. They were driven by the romantic urge to conquer unknown lands and gain new glorious victories. The severe warriors of the north believed that if they died in battle, they would get to Valhalla, the Norseman's heaven, where heroes enjoy endless feasts near constantly burning fires and fight each other until the last drop of blood is shed, only to resurrect again and again. The ships of the Vikings, when they appeared in Europe, filled the people with terrified awe. At the end of the 9th century, the Convocation of Metz officially included these words in prayers: "God save us from the cruelty of the Vikings." But it was not the monasteries of Western Europe that attracted the Vikings. Their main aim was the far land of Byzantium. Constantinople, the second Rome, the biggest and richest city in Europe. Even now, centuries later, though the Orthodox capital of the world has turned into the Muslim megapolis of Istanbul, the sight of these mighty walls explains what attracted thousands of adventure seekers from around the world. Here it is, the city of Constantine and its irreplaceable companion, Saint Sophia, the objects of endless claims from various barbarian hordes. Constantinople University was a world center of science. A network of free hospitals for the poor was part of the social policy of the empire, and a developed system of law guaranteed equal protection to everyone, irrespective of class and income. The economic prosperity of Byzantium was based on trade. Constantinople, being the center not only of Byzantium, but also of world trade, goods were brought here from around the world, from China, Samarkand, Persia, and Ethiopia. Through the Tsar city, caravans went to Arabia and further to the southeast of Africa, and through the Persian Bay, goods were carried from India and Ceylon. There was everything, the finest, thinnest silk and canvas, aromatic oils and wine, precious jewelry and houseware from around the globe. The Vikings that came to Constantinople could only dream of local markets, but there was a long way for them to go. The journey of the Vikings to the tempting Byzantine markets lay through the vast territory of the Eastern European Valley, severe northern lands, frigid rivers and lakes. This waterway was the only quick and safe way to reach Constantinople. It so happened that the main trade artery of the world, the way from the Vikings to the Greeks, was situated on the lands of Eastern Slavs. Our ancestors didn't enjoy fertile fields and a mild climate. They had to fight tooth and nail for their welfare, amid centuries-old forests and swamplands. It was here, in these severe climatic conditions, that a form of government, which later spread over half the earth, was formed. Enormous joint efforts were needed to survive and develop a special community spirit, which has remained part of our mentality. Pushed by the nomads of the Great Steppe, the Slavs inhabited these territories spreading north. Their main activity was agriculture. Step by step, they burnt down ancient forests and drained the swamplands. And here, they cultivated rye, wheat, and other plants. The crops were poor, so they had to supplement them with hunting and fishing. Besides, the Slavs kept bees and raised cattle. Such was the everyday life of our ancestors. But what constituted the inner content of their life? Its spiritual, metaphysical basis. The world of these people was deeply paradoxical. The difficulties of life made the Slavs rather pragmatic, but their perception of the world was absolutely irrational. Behind the visible world, there was another world for them, a magic world. In the understanding of a pagan Slav, each corner of the world was inhabited by creatures that had their own wills. People, animals, objects, and natural phenomena were controlled by magical forces. from moody, vindictive spirits to menacing and powerful gods. The god of thunder, Perun, and the god of the underworld, Veles, easily and naturally coexisted with mermaids, hobgoblins, pucks, and other evil spirits. The relationships with pagan gods resemble contracts. They are appeased with sacrifices, including human ones. But if a contract is not honored properly, one could get offended and easily substitute one idol with another. The god in this world is a lord, but not the creator. Death is a culmination point of human life, which is reflected in the well-developed Slavic ritual of the funeral feast. It was carefully described by an Arab traveler, Ibn Fadlan, who attended the funeral of a distinguished Russian in 922. The medieval author witnessed a complicated ritual with sacrifices and feasts. The center of the ritual was a slave woman who agreed to go to the underworld with her lord. The woman mounts the ritual boat where she is burnt with the dead man. Subjectively, it was an extremely uncomfortable and frightening world. Actually, real threats abounded too. Rapacious nomads, the Avars, the Cumans, and the Pechenegs came from the steppes of Eastern Europe. In the 8th century, the expansion of Judaists from Khazaria began. They controlled slave trading. Slavic women and children were especially valuable prey for them. People with blonde hair and blue eyes sold well at Arab and Khazar slave markets. There was vigorous trade between the south and the north of the Slavic world. The most venturous Slavs started to buy fur, honey, and wax from their fellow tribesmen and take them to the Byzantine markets. They brought back imported goods from the empire: silk, wine, spices, and expensive weapons. The Vikings took notice of this practice in around the 7th century. At the sight of packed boats laden with imported goods, the Vikings also felt an urge to lay hands on all that treasure. However, the sophisticated and time-tested expansionist policy of the Vikings didn't presuppose brutal force. The now politically correct descendants of Scandinavians displayed deft organizational skills. The Vikings offered Slavic merchants protection from the Pechenegs and the Khazars on the way from the Vikings to the Greeks. And to the princes they offered to provide order and security in the main trade centers: Novgorod, Lubitsch, Smolensk, Polotsk, and Chernigov. People came to these centers from different areas, and their local customs and tribal laws often collided. The presence of professional soldiers at Slavic markets prevented many intertribal conflicts. Thus, based on common economic interests, a partnership between Vikings and Eastern Slavs began. The Vikings gradually assimilated with the young Slavic elites. The first known Russian prince, Rurik, built his fortress here, in the outfall of the Volkhov River. This hill became an ideal barrier, a military base, an impassable gate on the route from the Vikings to the Greeks. No military or merchant ship, no boat loaded with fur and honey could pass unnoticed by Rurik and his men. The first Rurikids followed the same strategy as their relatives all over Europe. They created an outpost in a strategically important place, the aforementioned outfall of Volkhov, and started to protect it against encroachments, especially from other Viking clans. This policy was typical of those times. The Vikings did the same in France by taking control of the mouth of the River Seine. In Germany it was the Rhine, in England the Thames. On the territories they conquered, the Vikings set up a strict military administration. After that, they gradually took control over all the waterside areas helped provide for easy traffic on all trade waterways. In the case of Rurik and his clan, it was the way from the Vikings to the Greeks. The Rurikids were faced with an enormous geopolitical task: to gain control over a giant territory from the north to the Black Sea, which included 7 rivers and 2 lakes, 2,700 kilometers in total. Taking into account that they were no more than 50 people, their ambitions were astounding. Incredibly, the assimilated Rurikids were able to cope with this task. Over the course of just 1 century, they took control over Eurasia's main waterway, moved their capital to Kiev, and subdued 11 large Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes that had to pay tribute to them. However great the geopolitical successes of the first Rurikids had been, it was the power of military administration that was supported exclusively by the economic interests of the Vikings and the power of their weapons. Incontinent, 8-kilo axes and swords, combined with the readiness and even the desire to die in battle, gave the enemy practically no chance to survive. The issues of home policy didn't overshadow the main goal, the Byzantine Empire. Because to gain profits from the way from the Vikings to the Greeks, one had to be present at the world's main market. Every Russian prince tried to get involved with the Byzantine Empire, and the weapon they used was not diplomacy, but the way of war. The dragon ships of the Vikings appeared many times in the beamline of Constantinople, in the Golden Horn Bay. The results were different. The Greeks defended themselves from the barbarians as best they could, sometimes with prayers that sent a storm to destroy the enemy's fleet, and sometimes with the newest weapon of mass destruction called Greek fire, a mixture of fuel, wax and oil that burnt even in water. The only major Russian victory was prophetic Oleg's campaign. He put his military ships on wheels and with sails went right to the walls of Constantinople. This scared the Greeks to death. The emperor was obliged to sign a very unfavorable agreement, allowing free trade with Russia. In 907, the main geopolitical task of the Rurikids was completed, but for only 30 years, the term of the contract. The final eternal union with the Byzantine Empire would be concluded by Vladimir. The character of the future prince was strongly influenced by his grandmother, the cruel and authoritative Pskovian Princess Olga. The events of the beginning of Olga's rule are the brightest and at the same time the most horrible example of the pagan mindset. Mal, the prince of the Drevlian tribe, executed Igor, who had asked for additional tribute, in a brutal way. He tied him by the legs to the tops of 2 bowed-over trees. This act, according to the pagan traditions of the Slavs, gave him a right to the dead prince's widow. Olga's actions in response to this were autocratic and demonstrative. The Drevlian marriage brokerage was turned into a mystery play, a performance whose audience were the people of Kiev and its numerous guests. They were supposed to spread the news to various subordinate lands. The first Drevlian embassy was requested by Olga to come to the prince's yard in a boat that in Scandinavian mythology symbolized a wooden coffin. The ambassadors didn't solve the prince's puzzle and were buried alive. The second group of matchmakers that consisted, as Olga demanded, of the best men of the Drevlians' land was ceremoniously invited to the banya. This time, a Slavic symbol of birth and death lay hidden in the invitation, but it was not decoded by the self-confident guests, who were burnt alive after their ablutions. The third act of Olga's mystery play was a funeral feast, which she organized in the Drevlians' land, and which ended with a mass slaughter. A small group of Olga's warriors easily took care of 5,000 Drevlians, who were helplessly drunk after a generous feast. The end of the tragedy complied with the general idea of the grisly drama. As a wedding present, Olga asked for a pigeon from each house of the Drevlians' capital, Izkorostan. Her warriors tied burning tinder to the birds, which then flew back to their nests. In less than an hour, Izkorostan had burned to the ground. As all early medieval rulers, Olga travels extensively around the country. Her throne being in Kiev, she often visits the northern territories, Pskov and Novgorod. Everything in the country is under her eagle eye. According to legend, she was the founder of Vitebsk and Uglich. A chronicler wrote of her, "She has seen everything with her own eyes. The development of the country, as opposed to robbing it with brute force, characterized Olga's rule." In foreign politics, Olga also uses diplomatic methods. Like all the previous rulers, the princess aims to cooperate with the main economic center of that time, the Byzantine Empire. In the summer of 957, Olga undertakes a very dangerous and arduous journey to Constantinople. With her come 20 envoys, 43 merchants, and even a Christian priest. Her aim is to ensure long-term and stable economic cooperation. At an official reception, Olga tries to negotiate as if they were equals. But for Emperor Constantine, negotiations with pagans, and especially with a woman, are nothing more than a diplomatic incident. The negotiations come to a standstill. Olga understands that she can only change the situation if she does something extraordinary. And she does just that. She asks Emperor Constantine to be her godfather. According to myth, corroborated by the tale of bygone years, Princess Olga may have been baptized in this very baptistry, hidden from the eyes of visitors. Possibly it was in this very font. The baptism was followed by fruitful negotiations. The new Christian princess, baptized with the name Yelena, returned to Kiev with something of more value than a mere trade agreement. Now, when traveling around the country, Olga preaches the Christian faith and founds churches. The most famous of them is Trinity Cathedral in Pskov. Eastern Christianity might well have come to Russia with Olga's conversion, but Christian values were alien to her son, Sviatoslav Igorovich. Ascetic and soldierly, this prince became known as the Russian Saul, the integrator of the Slavic lands. The Byzantine chroniclers were so deeply impressed by Sviatoslav that they left this vivid verbal portrait. A low forehead, a flat nose, thick brows, a bold head with a scalp lock and a gold earring, with a carbuncle and 2 pearls in one ear. Historians call Sviatoslav Igorovich the Alexander the Great of the Slavic world. In 964, he invaded the lands of the Viatici, thus provoking a conflict with Khazaria. A year later, he defeated the army of the Khazar Khan and took Tmutarakan, which opened the way to the Black and the Caspian Seas for Russia. Russian chronicles give us a detailed description of his daily life. Sviatoslav didn't have a tent. He slept in the open air with a horse saddle under his head. He didn't take food with him and ate wild fowl and horse meat. In other words, if needed, he could eat his own horse. Sviatoslav was a true son of the Vikings. The urge for military glory and the rich southern lands drove him on to new campaigns. The Bulgarian campaign had to be the climax of his career. This is how Sviatoslav himself described his ambitions. I want to live in Pereyaslavetsk on Danube, as it is the center of my lands, where all the goods arrive. Gold, wine, and different fruit from the Greeks, silver and horses from the Czechs and the Hungarians, furs, wax, honey, and servants from Russia. But the powerful Byzantine Empire wouldn't give the prince of the barbarians access to their geopolitical space, the romantic warrior was not equipped to face the elaborate machinery of war and diplomacy that the empire had at its disposal. Soon Sviatoslav had to retreat to Russia with the remainder of his once undefeatable army. By the Dnieper Rapids, he was caught in a trap, and it was his last battle. His military activity had only lasted 8 years, from 964 to 972. His army was defeated by the Pechenegs, and his skull was turned into a carved bowl with these words inscribed on it: "Looking for more, you'll lose what you have." One could assume that Sviatoslav had no time to spend on raising his sons. Still, thanks to the policy of the prince, they learned a lot. Sviatoslav neglected to protect the boundaries of his land. When the prince was away with his army, Kiev was helpless in the face of external enemies. In 969, when the prince was absent, the capital of Russia was besieged by the Pechenegs. The Pechenegs were notorious for their bloodthirstiness, even in those cruel times. Bishop Bruno of Querfurt, who visited the country at the very beginning of the 11th century, called them the most cruel of all the pagans. The people with bloodthirsty eyes, the worst and the most cruel of all. Kiev would be devastated, and its people would become slaves. And so Olga locked herself in the city with her grandchildren, Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir. The siege of Kiev obviously lasted for a long time, because the people were starving and thirsty. During these tragic events, power was wrested from Olga's hands. The fate of the city was now in the hands of the people's gathering, and their decision was not in favor of the prince's family. It was decided to surrender to the mercy of the Pechenegs. Only a miracle could save Olga and her grandchildren. The only weapon the princess had was prayer. And a miracle did happen. On the opposite bank of the Dnieper River, the army of Pretich appeared, and the Pechenegs, mistaking it for Sviatoslav's mighty force, fled in fear. The city was saved, but the helplessness of his grandmother, the treason of the people's gathering that had betrayed the prince's family without a great deal of hesitation, was remembered by Vladimir. And later, these memories influenced his political style. Sviatoslav wanted to conquer the Bulgarian land, and later Constantinople itself. He divided the Russian territories between his young sons. The eldest, Yaropolk, was installed in Kiev, the middle son, Oleg, in the Drevlian lands, while Vladimir was offered the throne in Novgorod. When their father died, the lands of the young rulers lost their sacred connection and disintegrated into separate kingdoms. In the summer of 969, 8-year-old Vladimir leaves Kiev and travels for the first time in his life on the route from the Vikings to the Greeks. The incredibly vast lands of his father that spread from the Black Sea to the Baltic were doubtless a shock for the young prince. In such circumstances, how could one resist the idea of ruling the whole continent? The prince witnesses many ships loaded with honey, fur, jewelry and fabrics coming to him. A true outline of the economic and material potential of Russia. How could his father, driven south to the warm lands, loosen control of the main artery of the world's economy? It is the most tangible symbol of power. Then Vladimir realized that he had to work systemically. The citizens of Novgorod hoped that Vladimir would grow loyal to their way of life. Rich merchants came to the prince with presents. Who knows? They may have achieved their goal. Young people have always loved joyful things, but always at his side was Vladimir's devoted uncle, Dobrynya Malkovich, an authoritative army leader who shielded Vladimir from all kinds of lobbyists. While Vladimir was ruling in Novgorod, gaining political weight and administrative skills, his elder brothers engaged in a bloody war. The reason for it was somewhat trivial. Oleg, prince of the Drevlians, had executed the son of Kiev army leader Svenil for hunting in his lands. Svenil demanded that Yaropolk avenge the death of his son. For 2 years, the peace-loving prince in Kiev resisted the arguments of the Viking who had led the armies of his father and grandfather. But the Viking was apparently unyielding. In 977, during a battle for the new capital of the Drevlian land, Ovruch, Prince Oleg tragically dies, falling into a deep pit from a bridge when his army fled in panic. According to a chronicle, Yaropolk was shocked at what he had done. He cried over Oleg's body, saying, "Oh, woe is me, my dear brother. Better I die and you stay alive." But nothing could be changed. The murder of one's brother was a terrible crime, even for those times. Now, only 2 lawful rulers of Russia remained alive. Vladimir decides to flee to Norway. His devoted Dobrynya accompanies him. But the young prince is not going to hide in the fjord country. There, in the severe northern lands, he decided to gather a big army and return to Russia. His brother's crime gave Vladimir the right to fight for the main throne in Kiev. When Vladimir came to Norway, the world of the Vikings was going through Christianization. The Danish king Harald the Blueteeth had baptized his subjects and was trying to convert the neighboring countries. But his vassal, Hakon the Powerful, known for his love of women, fiercely opposed it and doubled his sacrifices to the pagan Scandinavian gods. The wonderful Norwegian landscapes provoke mystical thoughts even today. For the Vikings and Russians of that epoch, the power of nature was imbued with a genuine religious meaning. One can easily imagine what feelings the fugitive prince of Novgorod had. The magnificent rocks of the fjords, which according to myth appeared after a battle between the gods, inspired a magical, warrior-like power in the traveler. But it wasn't just the severe northern nature that fortified the prince's mysticism. He came to Norway in the midst of pagan reaction. His army was filled with warriors who hated Christianity, centralized power, and order in all its forms. Real bandits, the last romantics of the ending epoch of the Vikings. Probably during the feasts and the halts of his warriors, Vladimir listened to songs about the deeds of ancient heroes, ruthless to the enemy and tireless in their striving for heroism, quarry and power. The Christian god of his grandmother seemed weak and useless in that world. A young and passionate pagan was coming to conquer Russia. At that time, Novgorod was controlled by the governors of Yaropolk, but the free-spirited town never acknowledged the Kiev prince. In their eyes, he couldn't be a lawful ruler, as he had spilled the blood of his brother. When Vladimir returned from his 3-year exile, he took Novgorod without battle. The prince was welcomed. He now had a real opportunity to become the only lawful ruler of Russia. The war between the 2 brothers actually started with diplomatic steps on both sides. Both Vladimir and Yaropolk were interested in subduing the independent lands of Polotsk, situated between Kiev and Novgorod, and ruled by the Viking Rogvold. So both brothers sent their matchmakers to Rogvold's beautiful daughter, Rogneda. The whimsical princess made a terrible mistake when she answered the matchmakers, "I don't want to marry the son of a slave. I want to marry Yaropolk." If only Rogneda had known the consequences. The savage Vikings besiege and then take Polotsk. The offense is washed with the blood of Rogvold and his 2 sons. Before their execution, Vladimir dishonors the daughter in the presence of her parents and brothers. Rogneda is called a slave and deprived of her noble name and given the name of Gorislava. The news about Vladimir's bloody marriage in Polotsk shocked the people. Even then, when cruelty was common, now he was perceived as a true son of the cruel Sviatoslav. It was a perfect moment for the final battle for power. 980. Kiev is well armed and ready for a long siege. It is summer, and the campaign should be finished before the cold sets in. Vladimir and Dobrynya don't put their faith in swords and arrows, but on a far more terrible weapon: the greed of Kiev's army leaders and the cowardice of the city council. Vladimir announces to the Kievers that he's fighting against Yaropolk, not the city dwellers. He remembered how easily the city council decided to surrender when the city was besieged by the Pechenegs. The calculation was right. Discontent was soon to follow. The inhabitants of Kiev saw from the city walls violent Vikings in their horned helmets, for whom the devastation of the city was only a question of time. Nobody wanted to die for the honor of the prince, and a traitor was soon found. Yaropolk was betrayed by his own army's leader, a soldier called Blood. Yaropolk fled Kiev. According to the tale of bygone years, he wanted to ask the Pechenegs for help, but Blood treacherously convinced him to surrender to his younger brother. Yaropolk returned to the prince's palace, now occupied by Vladimir. As soon as the doors closed behind him, two Vikings from the prince's bodyguard pointed their swords at him. 17-year-old Vladimir became the ruler of Russia, but the Kiev throne meant hard work. The young prince was to restore the country, consolidating the lands that had fallen apart after the death of his father, Sviatoslav. After the annexation of Polotsk, Novgorod and Kiev were geographically, politically, and economically consolidated. But external enemies, the nomads of the steppes and the aggressive kingdoms of Western Europe, were a constant and objective threat, not only for the lands of Novgorod and Kiev, but for the whole of the East Slavic world. There was only one way for the prince to protect the independence of his country and to prevent the devastation of Russian lands, by uniting the separate Eastern Slavic tribes under his own rule. Vladimir spent the first 8 years of his rule pursuing wars. He conquered Cherven Rus, the lands of Vyatich, and the Radimich tribes. He won over the tribe of Yatviak, thus opening the way to the Baltic Sea. As a result of his campaign in Volga, Bulgaria, Russia broadened its trade with the Byzantine Empire, and the tribute he laid on the Khazars brought a considerable income to Kiev. The prince was passionate in everything. According to Nestor, the chronicler, he had several wives at his side, and 800 in different towns. He could have become a Russian Caligula. But seeing the power of his personality, God chose Vladimir for a different mission. Remembering the experience of his predecessors, Vladimir understands that his authority would remain virtual unless every person in his country, including its new territories, felt part of something bigger than his own small tribe. But how can he strengthen his power? How can he ensure that his people will be with him, not only in good times, but also in times of severe trials? He starts a religious reform. Vladimir sees that various tribal cults with their worship of different gods cannot unite the people. They cannot form the basis for a strong link between the ruler and the people. So Vladimir works out a hierarchy of pagan gods, and the main god is Perun, the deadly god of thunder and lightning. And so he put the idols on the hill outside his court, a wooden statue of Perun with a silver head and a golden mustache, also Kors and Dashborg, Simagl and Mokosh, and an altar for them, calling them gods. And the Russian land was stained with blood. Similar idols appeared not only in Kiev, but in all Russian towns where Vladimir sent his governors. The new pantheon of gods had to be supported by something considerable, and according to the laws of that time, something frightening and bloody. The prince's warriors and the people's gathering decide to offer a man in sacrifice to Perun, and their choice fell on Ion, son of a Christian Viking. According to the chronicles, Viking Fyodor, protecting his son from the prince's people, said to them, "These are not gods, but just wood. I won't give my son to the demons." Enraged, Vladimir orders the Christians to be put to death, but there's a seed of doubt planted in his heart. Before that moment, success never failed him. He achieved anything he wanted, but the alien Christian god was a different matter. He was more powerful. The old pagan gods couldn't help the prince in uniting the country and creating a powerful centralized state. There was an urgent need for a new god and a genuine faith, and he couldn't afford to make another mistake. Vladimir started to consider the religious systems that surrounded medieval Russia. According to the chronicles, the prince listened first to the Muslim ambassadors. During his military campaigns, Vladimir had many opportunities to see how brave and persistent the Muslims were in achieving their goals, so he listened attentively to the dogmas of their religion. His famous response, "Drinking is Russia's biggest joy," was nothing more than a diplomatic refusal, neither yes nor no, in order not to spoil relations with a spirited neighbor. Catholic missionaries that came after them offered Vladimir a rather broad interpretation of Apostle Paul's words from his first address to the Corinthians. Fast if you feel capable. If someone eats and drinks, this too is for the glory of God. But the answer was, go away. Our fathers accepted that. Just a few years before that conversation, he had witnessed a bloody revolt of Baltic Slavic tribes. It was a violent massacre of priests they considered their enslavers. Preparing to adopt a new faith, Vladimir kept in mind the questions of national security. Through accepting a new faith, Russia shouldn't have to suffer political dependence. Next came the Khazars, Judaists. This is what the chronicle says. And so Vladimir asked them, "Where is your homeland?" They answered, "In Jerusalem." And he asked, "Are you sure it's there?" And they answered, "God was enraged with our fathers and scattered us over the earth for our sins." Vladimir's response was, "How can you teach others if you yourselves are outcasts and scattered? Or do you wish the same for us?" Vladimir's acquaintance with Judaism was not surprising, as its followers were quite well known in Russia. When Kiev was founded, it was on the outskirts of the Khazar country, and the Polian tribe had once paid tribute to the Khazars. The last was a Greek philosopher. He came from Byzantium, where he was respected as a person extremely knowledgeable in religious questions. Continuing the policy of its founder, Emperor Constantine the Great, Byzantium didn't engage in the aggressive propagation of Christianity. The missionary activity of the empire was confined to apostolic practice. It was not a politician that spoke to Vladimir, but a preacher. The Greek philosopher didn't just recount the Old and the New Testament to the prince. The decisive moment was when he showed Vladimir a painting of the Last Judgment. Even a modern person can't stay indifferent when presented with icons depicting the Last Judgment. The sinners exposed to eternal suffering cause those who haven't yet given a thought to what they may expect after death to tremble. The first thought that occurs is how to avoid this eternal damnation. How can one be among those who are destined for paradise? "Blessed are those who are on the right, woe unto those who are on the left," said Vladimir in amazement. "If you want to be with the blessed, baptized," was the Greek's answer. Not only the dogmas of the new faith, but also the ceremonies influenced the prince's decision. He sent his envoys, 10 good and clever men, to Constantinople, where they witnessed a sumptuous liturgy in the main church of the Second Rome, St. Sophia's Cathedral. What they saw didn't leave the experienced prince's envoys indifferent. The architecture of a Byzantine church is based on a specific rhythm. Time stops here, vanity and passions retreat. When you enter, it feels as if you are in heaven. The gold, the silver, wonderful mosaics and frescoes are not intended to demonstrate wealth. Everything is subdued to the divine nature of being in a church, where the earthly and the heavenly meet. The report of the envoys is contained in the tale of bygone years. So he came to the Greek land, and we were led into the place where they worship their God. And we didn't know if we were still on earth or in heaven, because nowhere on earth is there such beauty, and we don't know how to describe it. What we do know is that God is with the people there, and their service is better than in any other country. We will never forget that beauty, because once you try the sweet, you won't take the bitter. The same goes for us. We will never remain the same. So the authentic beauty of the Christian faith attracted the Russians. The decision of the prince was not individual, but nationwide. The boyars and the greybeards, the power holders and the elite, through their representatives in the embassy, approved of his choice. "Where will we be baptized?" asked the prince. "Where you choose," is the response of the council. The choice had been made, but Vladimir was not going to adopt Byzantine Christianity humbly. His decision embodied political expediency, as well as incredible pride. He desired a status equal to Roman rulers, and it was not his mere willfulness, but a sober calculation in view of the geopolitical situation of that time. The Byzantine Empire is faced with a bloody separatist revolt. Following the agreement that has been signed by Sviatoslav, the Russian army led by Vladimir helps to restore peace in the empire. But what does the barbarian prince ask for in return? He wants to marry Princess Anna, Emperor Vasily II's sister. This was outrageous. Anna of Byzantium was a royal princess, daughter of a basileus. By the laws of the empire, she couldn't marry a barbarian, the owner of a large harem. But there was more to it than that, because the union would automatically make him a claimant for the throne. Vladimir had probably heard of the misfortune of the German Emperor Otto II, who had offered to marry the princess before him. But since his victory at Polotsk, Vladimir knew the way to success. Vladimir and his soldiers came to the Byzantine port of Chersonese. The city, founded by the ancient Greeks 2,500 years ago, is situated at the southwestern edge of the Crimean Peninsula. Strategically, it's the most important part of the Crimea. That's why Sevastopol, the main naval base of the Russian Empire, was later built there. In the 9th century, Chersonese was not only a very important Black Sea port of the Byzantine Empire, but also one of the main world centers of Christianity. It was here that St. Andrew the Apostle began his ministry, as did Kirill and Methodius. On the central square of Chersonese, there were 7 splendid Christian cathedrals with holy relics and icons. Vladimir tries to attack the city. His warriors start building a mound around the city walls to get into the city. But the locals, having dug a mine, dig out the earth and create a hill in the center of the city. The siege lasts for 9 months. Eventually, Vladimir uses a war route. He trenches the water pipe going to the city, the ruins of which have remained until today. Left without water, it's not long before Chersonese is forced to surrender. Having set up camp in the Crimea, Vladimir is master of the situation. He can dictate his will to the emperors Vasily and Constantine. He threatens to seize Constantinople unless Princess Anna agrees to marry him. The Vasileuses have to give in, but there is one condition. Vladimir must be baptized. As a policymaker, Vladimir realized that pagan cults prevented Russia from communicating as equals with other countries, which hampered its development. The whole of Europe and even Scandinavia, the pillar of pagan cults, had been Christianized by the 10th century. The interests of the young Russian state dictated that Vladimir should embrace Christianity. What were Vladimir's feelings when he was preparing to accept the new faith? As a true strategist, he was used to getting the maximum possible benefit out of any situation. Raised by a pagan warrior, Dobrynia, with hands covered with his brother's blood, dreaming to subdue Slavic pagan gods, passionate and ambitious, he was at the peak of his greatness and didn't know humility. Vladimir wanted the Greek god as a trophy, but he was, in fact, destined to accept him with his heart. A miracle happens. Vladimir, like Apostle Paul, without warning becomes blind. Mighty and great, he suddenly becomes helpless, miserable and sunken in darkness. When Princess Anna comes to Korsun and learnt about what happened, she told the prince, "If you want to recover from your illness, baptize." The baptism took place in the main church of Korsun, right here. The church was destroyed and rebuilt, but the memory of this sacred place lived. 1,000 years later, the magnificent Saint Vladimir Cathedral would be built on the foundation of the ancient church. Baptism is a necessary condition of becoming a Christian. The ceremony presupposes that you accept God and abandon that which is against Him, that which is against God. During baptism, the nature of a person changes. His old shabby persona vanishes, and a clear way to salvation opens up for him. Water plays a special role in baptism. Water washes the person of all the sins he has committed in the past. When an adult is baptized, his soul is relieved. This is felt even physically. Baptism opens new opportunities for a person. A new life starts. Baptism also means an oath, because during it one pledges, "I abandon you, Satan." The old Prince Vladimir ceased to exist the moment he was baptized. Moreover, the pagan country he ruled lost its old nature. Coming out of the font, he said, "Now I see the true God." Baptism changed Prince Vladimir completely. He accepted the new faith wholeheartedly, sincerely, with all the passion of his outstanding personality. He adopted not only the external attributes, sumptuous church services, the gold of the churches, but also the new concepts of right and wrong, sin and virtue, the values of the visible and the invisible world. Vladimir's coming to Christianity was a result of a long, hard road. A search for the true sense of life, and most importantly, the sense of a prince's authority. He didn't treat Christianity merely as a symbol of his own greatness. The moral side of faith was more important for him. The chroniclers wrote that Vladimir often went to church. A deacon was always at his side, reading the Bible to him. The prince listened attentively, and many things he understood literally. Soon after his conversion, Vladimir made an attempt at judicial reform. Driven by ideas of love and grace, he decided to do away with executions of highwaymen, who were numerous at the time. When asked by the bishops for his reasons, he humbly said, "I'm afraid of sin." Later, Vladimir reinstated executions, but with great limitations, often substituting them with fines. Princess Anna was now Vladimir's only lawful wife. Out of piety, Vladimir refused to live with his numerous wives. He asked them for forgiveness and paid them a considerable allowance. Even before Christianization, Vladimir was known for his generosity, but after it his charity became epic. He ordered that every pauper be allowed to enter the prince's court and be given food, drinks, and even money. His servants brought food and honey on carts to the homes of the poor and sick. But the main quality of the new Christian prince was his love of peace. Even today, 1,000 years later, the peaceful Christianization of Russia surprises and fascinates historians, because in later centuries, much smaller reforms led to great bloodshed. At the time when Hungary and the Czech lands were burning with anti-Christian revolts, The Christianization of Russia was made not by force, but by virtue of persuasion, by a clear call of the prince.
Если кто не придет завтра на реку, богатый
If any of you
или
don't
убог,
come to the
или
river
нищий, или
tomorrow,
раб,
whether
да
rich
будет
or poor
противник
or a
мне.
slave, you'll be my enemy.
Христианское преображение
The new
Владимира
faith
не
didn't
позволяло
permit Vladimir
ему
to spill
утверждать
blood for the
крещение на крови.
Christianization of the country. The tale of bygone years tells about the fire and the sword with which Dobrynia and Putyata Christianized Novgorod. But it doesn't mean the mass slaughter of people living in Novgorod. The fire mentioned in the chronicle is not the torching of homes of persistent pagans, but the burning of idols. The pagan cult figures burnt by Prince Vladimir stood right here on the hill near the head of the Volkhov River. It was here 9 years before Christianization, in 980, that Vladimir built Perun's Grove, a pagan temple devoted to Perun. In 995, a wooden church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin was erected to replace the pagan altars, and in the 13th century it was rebuilt in stone. The new Christian prince devotedly builds new churches all over Russia. According to a German chronicler, Titmar of Merseburg, in 1018, around Kiev and its suburbs alone, there were some 400 churches. It was also the time when the first Russian monasteries appeared. They were fully financed by the prince. Following the biblical example, Vladimir introduces a tithe, which existed neither in the Roman Church nor even in Byzantium. Thus, the church becomes an indispensable element of the prince's authority. For a Christian, the church is the home of God. This was what Vladimir and his subjects felt. The effect that Christian liturgy had on the people's souls was obviously much greater than that of pagan rituals. Gradually, the churches started to fill with worshippers. First came the elite, the nobles and the warriors. Then came ordinary folks. Thinking of the fruits of Russia's Christianization, one is amazed how quickly a wild and unorganized territory turned into a mighty state, recognized by the entire civilized world. Thanks to Prince Vladimir, separate Slavic Finno-Ugric tribes, scions of the Vikings, were turned into a people, a nation that acquired the gift of creativity, the gift of love, embodied in the idea of a liturgical state. Russian urban culture was enriched with marvelous churches, the erection of which signified the development of art, craft and education. The following generation of Russians was already qualitatively different. The martyrdom of Vladimir's sons Boris and Gleb, the first Russian saints, is an example of true Christian thinking and culture. The young Russian people followed its Christianizer in wholehearted acceptance of the new faith, and through it gained the utmost meaning. The political aspirations and spontaneous actions of Vladimir's predecessors were replaced by a clear political doctrine. The organization of the state, the laws, domestic and foreign policy, in many senses were even better than in Europe. The true apostolic church flourished and developed in Russia, supported by a ruler equal to the Byzantine emperors. The ruler's authority itself now acquired a sacred meaning. The ruler became a father to his people. Such an elevated concept of temporal power and its bearer formed the basis of the Russian political consciousness. The most important achievement of Saint Vladimir was that through Byzantine Christianity, he created us as a nation, without invading our personal freedom granted by God. A people's history, like a living creature, has its basic features. A child that takes after his ancestors grows with these qualities, becomes aware of them, and passes them on to the following generations. The innate qualities remain forever, and it's not an attribute of birth, but a law of the universe. Similarly, the Russian state has inherited the qualities of its progenitor, and without remembering it, one can't comprehend one's history and understand the challenges of the time. Even now, 1,000 years after his death, Saint Vladimir equal to the apostles, is with us to remind us of the duty to preserve our motherland as a step to salvation.